So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this, technically speaking, is the first map that I was sent by the Womb Raider of the two sort of siege battles slash scenarios that he has created, albeit this one is probably going to appear about 2 to 3 weeks after the first one if you can cast your mind back to the Runic Port map that was on the test build of the new patch, which we should have already seen by this point. This one is going to be on the old version of the game, though I believe there was an attempt to run it on the new version as well, but this is the version that I have, and by the time that that version may have been run, I may very well already be on another work trip away, unfortunately for myself. This one, though, does bear some similarities to that in terms of the layout. We have this cityscape map, which is longer than it is wider, and this one, at the very least, also offers the attackers a chance to actually get some of the settlement under their control right from the off, albeit I don't know how useful that's actually going to be with the fact that they need to cross one of two bridges to actually push on into the rest of the settlement anyway, and we all know how bridges can be in Medieval 2. I'm already seeing that this rather bizarre rock formation in the back of the map over here is really the calling card of the maps that the Womb Raider has made so far, including the 8-way free-for-all we saw. So that's something to watch out for, I suppose. This one's going to be a bit more of an Arnorian inspired one, I believe, with Cardolan, Arthedain, I believe, making up a good portion of the defenders, and that makes sense. This style of map often does end up being Arnorian in nature. They've also got the Shire marching alongside them today as well. So we'll go through the attackers first and foremost, as we often do, which are going to be the red team today, and starting off with Winged Swordsman 44, who's going to be playing as the Angmarim. We've seen the Angmarim briefly in action in the new patch as well, and stylistically, of course, they're not going to change. They are an aggressive faction with more defensively minded units than not, lots of heavy armour that they pack on and the like. They're always going to be played in much the same way. They're a very simplistic faction. It's a very effective manner of waging war. But if it doesn't work, Angmar don't really have too much in the way of plan Bs that they can fall back on, unless you count the Witches being something of a panic button as a plan B. But they're always welcome when it comes to an attacking force because of how resilient they can be. The upgraded Witcher pikemen among the Orcish factions, at the very least, offer a very, very solid unit of pikes, which few of the others can match. Isengard, of course, can, but it's central to their very identity, whereas with Angmar it's more of an accent to what they're all about. Even though, in this version of the game in particular, with the Dunedain Rangers being what they are, the crossbows that Cardolan have at their disposal, ranged units are always going to be a problem for pikes, and even with their upgraded armour, considering the kind of tools that the Hobbits and the Arnorians have at their disposal, not necessarily going to be the be-all and end-all here. We also have some upgraded Witchram Hammer Guard as well. The armour piercing on them, very useful against many of the Western kingdoms. Less so perhaps against the Hobbits, but through sheer quality the Hobbits don't really have anything that can go toe-to-toe with something like the Hammer Guard, unless you count maybe keeping them at arm's length with Proudfoot Protectors or something like that, so not too scared Angmar will be of the forces that lay right in front of them, outside of maybe some of the more monstrous units. But speaking of monstrous units, Angmar do have some options of their own in that regard as well, with some Trolls of Gundabad, and also some Trolls of Angmar as well. Of course, in the new version of the game we've seen these units expanded in terms of the amount that's in them, but for here they are still going to be pretty effective at what they do, being that battlefield juggernaut that we all know them to be. There's not really anything else we can see of the Angmarim over here directly. So that means there's probably going to be a lot of hidden units around, which suggests maybe a more numerous approach from Angmar, which is rare. We'll see. Maybe a little bit offbeat from them, which is pretty nice to see. It's nice to see a faction which generally only has one modus operandi try to go about it in a different way at the very least. We've already briefly mentioned Isengard, played by Tommy the Wise here. They're a little bit more well-rounded than Angmar, but they go about things in a somewhat similar way, maybe not quite as aggressively, and they do have a few more supporting units as well. The Dunlending Clansmen, anti-cavalry is also something Isengard don't lack for, because even their lowly Dunland units have got that extra little boost in that regard, but in terms of their abilities in melee they are going to struggle a little bit against the higher quality units that many of the defenders can bring. Isengard are not the best at skirmishing long range, although unlike a faction like Erebor, for example, which simply can't do that, they do at least have the option to field some basic Uruk-hai archers here. Not the best in terms of damage dealing or indeed taking damage, but it does give them that ability to at least contest the long range fight, which can be very important for attackers, as we've seen time and time again. in these battle replays. Uruk-hai infantry back here as well. A little bit surprised not to see the Guardians of Cardolan, the associated unit from Angmar, but a very, very well-rounded unit, the Uruk-hai infantry. They are fairly expensive for a unit of sword and board infantry, especially among the Orcish factions, but they're very well outfitted. For the kind of unit that they are, they do a decent amount of damage, but unlike with a few other units in this example, they don't sacrifice any of their survivability to do so, and the ability to withstand punishment is very, very important for a unit of line infantry like this. We've got the Half-Orc Bane Guard as well. They've got some armor piercing, and that's, again, like I said, going to be useful against the Western Kingdoms that the Arnorians are made up of. Both Cardolan and Arthedain, to varying extents, are reliant upon their armour, and so basic shock infantry like this can really be very efficient. We've already briefly mentioned the Uruk-hai pikemen. They don't need to have their armour upgraded to be as solid as they are, but they still have all the same weaknesses that we mentioned with the Witchround pikemen as well, and it's weaknesses that certainly all of the defenders that I believe are on the field today can exploit. The crossbows are an interesting one though. As we often see, if crossbows are allowed to have their way with defenders when they're on the attacking army, it can be very difficult for the defenders to recover from that. The sheer amount of damage that crossbows are able to do in a short space of time to most kinds of units in the game means that you cannot allow them to get set. It is a little bit easier to maneuver them out of position and make it so they can't really do that damage in comparison to archers, but it's still something which the defenders are going to have to be on the ball with if they intend to go on to win this. Uruk-hai crossbows, and then we do have as well the Nazkai, very, very dangerous with the armour piercing that they can do. One of the very best in the game at doing that sort of thing, much like the Hammer Guard they're marching alongside today. The Guards of Orthanc are a very, very solid unit of spears. They're not going to be spectacular in terms of dealing damage, but they will, at the very least, be able to withstand a good deal of punishment, and also some Trolls of the White Hand here. So no lack for Trolls on the attacking force today. One of the attacking armies which already is occupying at least a portion of the settlement is, well, here's the Isengard Ballista for Tommy, which is going to be marching alongside Rhudaur, played by Adin Men. Rhudaur, much like Angmar, are always welcome on the attack, but for very different reasons. Individually, they are far more fragile than their overlords from the north, but their supporting units are incredibly useful in a situation like this. They're throwing projectiles. Arguably, they're the best throwing projectile faction in the game in this older build, anyway. That may well change moving forward, but we shall have to wait and see on that one. Rhudaur swordsmen are basic, but highly numerous, and they will make for a decent workhorse on the front line. Lower armour, though, does mean that they do lack, certainly in comparison to something like the Uruk-hai infantry that we've already seen. More of them here. Rhudaur marksmen, much like the Uruk-hai archers, they're not spectacular in terms of their ability to take or deal damage at long range, but the expanded ammunition supply they have does mean that they will be able to sustain pressure at long range if the defenders allow them to, and that is an important distinction because it does mean that the defenders will have to make that choice. Will they try and bring down the Rhudaur marksmen, or will they not? Will they allow that limited but still present damage to take its hold? The Witchrealm Enslavers represent much the same kind of unit as the Witchrealm Hammer Guard and the Nazkai we've already seen, so there's a lot of high-end armour-piercing punch that the attackers have at their disposal here today. There's also plenty of pikemen in there. Basic though they may be, Dunman pikemen will still represent a problem if Rhudaur are able to take control of the frontline engagement. It gives them that anchor which a lot of their more damaging units can maybe then take advantage of. Upgraded Rhudaur clansmen represent maybe the most cost-effective defensive unit of infantry they have on the front line. Among spears, they're not actually that bad at dealing damage, but they are ultimately what they are. They are still a more numerous and slightly lesser defended force than their brethren from further south are able to muster. There's also, I believe, some Etenmore's Troll Hunters in there. Indeed there are. The Franodine pikemen represent a higher tier unit of pikes. Pretty soon, of course, being a shielded pike is not going to be as unique as it once was. It's still going to be rarer than not, but even still, Franodine pikemen will not be able to lord that over many of their allies for that much longer. And finally, we have another Angmarim army under the command of King Arthur. He has got some Angmar halberds and marauders on the front line, so again, maybe a slightly lighter look to the Angmarim army here today. As basic as these units are, the numbers are still going to be useful, especially in a 4v4 siege like this. Simply having limitless numbers is not the sort of thing that the attackers can simply take for granted when this is the case. But even so, you do have to take into account that these units are not going to be able to withstand the punishment or, gain you as much ground as, for example, something like the Guardians of Cardolan and Witcher-on Pikeman combination would be able to do, though I'm sure we'll get onto those in just a moment. The halberds do offer a bit of armour piercing in exchange for that at the very least. We have some bodyguard units as well, once again the upgraded hammer guard, and also the more defensive option in the Witcher-on Blackguard as well. Sword and board bodyguards tend to be a little bit less spectacular, but the very best of them can be very, very dependable, and the Witcher-on Blackguard can count themselves among that elite number. We have Great Shield Infantry as well in the Black Watcher Legion. I don't know whether Angmar have got the sheer numbers necessary to make this an instant win button, at least in terms of one single defensive line. But we'll have to wait and see on that. It depends on how willing the defenders are to put everything on the line to try and stop their push. The Witcher-on Scourge Raiders, perhaps one of the last battles we'll ever see, with them being a unit on foot, of course, because they're being transferred to a cavalry variant of the same name in the next patch. They will functionally be, and stylistically indeed, the riders will look the same, but it does change them mechanically a little bit. And there they are. And then finally at the back, I've already briefly mentioned, the combination of upgraded Guardians of Kharn Dûm and Witcher-on Pikemen, the hard centre to many an Angmar push. And once they get set up, they can be very difficult to get rid of if you don't have plentiful armour piercing and ranged support. Barrow Wights are the thing which I'd be interested to see pop in, especially on the other side of the field, where we don't see too much of the army left available. Now then, the Womb Raider, the Elven contingent on the field today. The mapmaker himself has decided to claim playing as Imladris for himself. Gwaithí Myrdain, and we've got the God Helym as well, so higher end units. The armour piercing from Gwaithí Myrdain will be incredibly useful against Angmar, and Isengard actually, less so against Rhudaur. The God Helym as well. We've seen briefly actually in a few battles, both on the old patch and on the new one, the Silverthorn arrows finally being used for their intended purpose of breaking up advancing columns of infantry. Can be really useful against Angmar as well, to stifle their momentum a little bit. Archers of Rivendell and Eldarenway Swordmaster. I mean, Imladris are not, of all the Elven factions, they're the least archer focused, but make no mistake, especially against Angmar, who have basically no archers to speak of, they're still going to be utterly dominant at long range, and the damage they can do is still impressive enough to the point where Angmar cannot take anything for granted. And in melee, of course, Eldarenway Swordmasters and BRUINEN River Wards, that level of base damage, as much as Angmar's armour will help them there, the elves tend to have stats high enough to the point where it's not going to be enough to claim victory all on its own. Imladris Sentries as well offer a pike unit which is going to be able to outperform Angmar's 1-to-1, so that again incentivises the Angmarim to bring more numbers. Unupgraded all of these units though, including the Imladris Guardians. Even without that armour upgrade though, they're still one of the very best examples of line infantry units in the game, pound for pound. And then we also have the Swords of Rivendell as well to help bulk out those numbers a little bit. Interesting to see no upgrades though. Imladris don't necessarily need them, but it is one distinction which they hold over their Elven brethren, the fact that they do have access readily to so many armour upgrades. The Central Army, under the command of T.S. Niehoff, is Arthedain, one of the factions playing, I guess, de facto on home turf today. We have the Trebuchet right in the middle of things over here. The duel between it and the Isengard Ballista is going to be fairly key. The Trebuchet, based on its position, should be able to get the first volleys off, but if they miss, the Isengard Ballista is very unlikely to, given how laser accurate it can be and how large the Trebuchets actually are. Dunedain Scouts, are horse archers going to be all that useful on a map of this nature? I don't know. The Dunedain Troll Slayers are hidden, unsurprisingly, armour piercing at range and in melee. Arthedain Marksmen, given what Rudaur and Isengard are like, Arthedain should be fairly comfortable in a long-range skirmish fight. I think in general, the ranged war, if it comes down to it, is going to be won by the defenders, and the attackers are going to have to be a little bit more all-out aggression if they are to claim victory here. Dunedain Peacekeepers should be really good actually against the lighter foot units from Rudaur, and even of course the slightly more numerous force that Angmar have decided to bring today. Peacekeepers once again. We've got Evendim Spearmen, Wardens of the North right in the middle of things as well, arm-piercing archers, in addition to those two-handed swords that they have. A few pikes here and there, the Grey Company hidden in amongst things as well. The Grey Company, of course, maintaining access to those body-piercing projectiles they have in this version of the game into the new patch anyway, so they will perform here as they will in that version of the game. Dismounted Knights of Illuminus as well. Like I said, with the Blackguard, they're unspectacular sword and board bodyguard units, but dependable at their very best, and the Dismounted Knights of Illuminus count themselves among that number too. Seraphim is going to be playing as the other Arnorian Petty Kingdom, the third and final one in Cardolan. Minhiriath Spearmen, dependable enough. Cardolan's morale is obviously the thing which is always a bit of a black mark against their name amongst their regular troops, in spite of how effective they can be. We shall see how they do here. Mercenary Cavalry I mean, especially it goes for the mercenaries. Cardolan in general have morale problems when you pile their mercenary nature on top of that. That can only get worse. And melee cavalry, single HP. I don't know what the thinking is behind bringing a unit like this. I mean, it does offer you a little bit of mobility, but surely all of Arthedain's horse archers can handle that for you. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. I have been wrong about single HP cavalry in this version of the game before, but hopefully this is one of the last times that we have to put up with such ineffective units gracing the field. Tharbad Warhammers, another unit which is very similar, actually more similar to many of the units which are on the attacking side today. Very nice armor-piercing damage values on them. Plenty of pikes as well, Greenway Garrison Footmen. One thing that Cardolan can do is use lower tier units effectively in sync with one another to be able to form a surprisingly effective front line, but it does require a lot of maintenance, so we'll see, and it does require the range support coming in to be plentiful. Minhiriath Men-at-Arms are here, as well as the Greenway Garrison Spearmen too. There's the Dunedain Captains in and amongst things as well, another heavy swordsman unit. Should be good at carving through, especially the entry-level Isengard units. Civilians, crossbows in and around this little keep up here, with Men-at-Arms gatekeepers, and nothing else over on this side of things. I think that's pretty much it. There's more sharpshooters, which probably need to get out of harm's way pretty quickly as Isengard advance through the farmland. And last but not least, we have Django. I don't know how much of the Shire we're actually going to be able to see. Notoriously, they have got a lot of their units that can hide. Sheriffs of the Farthings, that's more mobile units. I don't know. I mean, based on the shape of this map, it's going to be difficult for all of these units of cavalry to be super effective, and generally the defenders need their cavalry to be super effective. Maybe not so much in a 4v4, but we'll see. It's a risk. In Shiltron formation, we have some hobbitry and arms. It's very rarely seen, actually, in this version of Reforged. I remember way back when it was far more common, but here they are nonetheless. A couple of units of them. Proudfoot Protectors, the Great Eagles hidden in amongst them as well, with the Ents. 3 units, really, which are going to be vital for the Hobbits' chances of trying to blunt Angmar's advance, regardless of what trickery Winged Swordsman has waiting in the wings. If there's something that the Hobbits don't lack, however, it is armor-piercing, so they can try and equalise the fight against Angmar in that respect, I suppose. Battling Brandy Bucks and Farms of Buckland, I'm sure, are hidden in and amongst things as well. Crossbows plentiful over on this side between the Shire and Cardolan, of course, and rather labyrinthine, this settlement. There's plenty of good opportunities for the defenders to get into some really nasty defensive chokeholds if they're paying attention. The attackers, however, momentum is certainly going to be their friend. There's no real need for a cut on this one, however. It's not the longest battle in the world, and indeed the armies are relatively close to one another right from the off, so without further ado, let's get this show on the road. And almost immediately as we begin popping into view, we see some Witchram Inquisitors, so that tells me that there is something about this terrain over here which is allowing these units to hide as well as anything else. Some Angmar Marauders moving forwards as well, though I would recommend, for Angmar's purposes anyway, that they don't simply charge unthinkingly into this area. Very recently, of course, we saw the Hobbits defend their land from an Arnorian invasion. Now the former enemies fight on the same side. Angmar do represent quite a different challenge in terms of an aggressive push than the Arnorians did, but still, Angmar cannot afford to simply charge unthinkingly into so much armour piercing, not only from the Hobbits, but also there's going to be the support coming forth from Cardolan as well. Men-at-Arms gatekeepers, crossbows of all descriptions. It's going to be an interesting one, this, the heavy metal approach of both Angmar and Isengard against the fragile in some ways, but very dangerous in terms of the damage they can deal, Cardolan and the Shire. Something else worth bearing in mind as well is almost certainly going to be the artillery duel, which we briefly mentioned as well. The Trebuchet from T.S. Niehoff is actually pulling back, perhaps in anticipation of what the ballista may bring. The issue as well that the ballista does give to the defenders is the fact that they may not be able to post up on the other side of the bridges as easy as they would like if the ballista is there, because they will simply be skirmished down. Very tense situation over here between Winged Swordsman's Angmarim and the Hobbits already lining up in defensive shape, but still not the full beginning of the battle yet. It's also quite interesting that Cardolan are actually going to contest this little lower section of the settlement as well. It does give them a little bit more of an advantageous position for their own skirmishers, but it is risky from an infantry perspective. The quality of many of the Greenway units not going to be able to keep pace with some of the scarier things that in particular Isengard are going to bring to the table down here. I mean, Angmar are also bringing some of their units down, but it's going to mainly be an Isengard affair over here. Over yonder we have more of the Angmarim as well, albeit Imladris already taking shelter behind the big stone walls. And undoubtedly, if Imladris can get into a good defensive position, it's going to be a pretty torrid time for any attacking force, even Angmar, with the strengths that they have at their disposal. Meanwhile, the ballista. Interesting that Arthedain are deciding to unflinchingly stand right here. The ballista will be able to rip through the ranks of these spearmen without too many issues, and trebuchet here also. I can only assume this is a de facto grace period, given the fact that there are plenty of opportunities for both sides at this point to really do an awful lot of damage to one another. Again, we've already mentioned the slightly labyrinthine nature of this settlement. There's plenty of opportunities for the defenders to fall back should they feel the need to. But especially with how front-loaded the Cardolan approach seems to be, I'm not certain they're going to have the room to be able to pull back. I mean, this is interesting. One Skiltron unit of Hobbitry and arms, from what we can see, facing down the might of an Angmar advance. That's exactly the sort of thing which may go south for them fairly quickly. Very dense defensive blocks, though. And further up, just trying to see if the artillery has started trading back and forth just yet on the higher ground. Down here in the lower reaches, the Trolls of the White Hand, Cardolan do have a few options, namely the Dunedain captains down here that will be able to deal with trolls, but generally speaking, Cardolan pride themselves on a more efficient front line, made of spears and pikes, the kind of units that trolls tend to be pretty damn efficient at dealing with themselves. I'm not actually sure about the numbers that the Trolls of the White Hand will have at their disposal per unit in the next version of the game, considering the differences that have already been set up in the Trolls' numbers. Angmar setting themselves up. I mean, Imladris going to be defending largely from the front. Interesting setup that they have here. If Angmar do push a little bit more directly into Imladris' territory, they could cut off several units, but they're going to have to try and face down the full force of the Imladris army, so I don't know whether Angmar on their own will be able to do this, but the attackers per army should have a little bit more quality to work with. A little bit further up, Clansmen. There's also the Isengard Ballista, which instead of firing directly across the bridge, going to instead be firing down into the Cardolan position, and they're going to rely instead upon their archers to do the business. I mean, that is a very dense formation of Minhiriath sharpshooters, and they get punished accordingly by the Ballista. Though in all fairness to Cardolan, they probably weren't expecting Isengard to attack them. I think we will actually go down to half speed, because things are likely to get pretty chaotic, at least initially, with some very different avenues of attack. I mean, this one unit of Hobbitry and arms has unsurprisingly been utterly crushed by the Angmar attack. But the rest of the Hobbit army revealing themselves as well. Bandits, farmers of Buckland, the Sheriffs of the Farthings may also be able to utilise their own projectiles here. And they may need to. You can see there the big charge of the Sheriffs of the Farthings actually causing one of the initial trolls to fall. We saw how surprisingly vicious the hobbits could be when they were defending their homeland. How will they do when they defend the homeland of the Arnorians as well? Angmar Marauders yet to move in directly. Snaga skirmishers trying to open up with some initial volleys. Perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising that Isengard elected to try and focus down Cardolan over here, considering the vast majority of this push up here is going to have to be enacted by Rhudaur. The only Isengard unit that was on top of this position over here was the Ballista after all. Defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle initially. We did mention how the Rhudaur clansmen could be slightly stronger in terms of their ability to deal melee damage. Further afield, and it is just the spears for the time being, just testing the waters. I don't think Rhudaur need to rush here. They can afford to be a little bit more reticent in their approach. I think over there, where we saw Angmar and Isengard moving forward, is the most likely victory for the attackers, although there are the crossbows and rangers to contend with. It's over here where I would be a little bit more worried for the attackers. You can see here that King Arthur has stacked up accordingly to begin an assault on Imladris, but Imladris aren't going anywhere. You are going to need to get into them sooner rather than later, and how they are set up is a little bit awkward from an Angmarim perspective. There's no avoiding the fact that Imladris is going to be able to engage you at least partially on their own terms, as is often the way in a defensive siege, but Angmar are pretty good at catching people off guard on occasion. Hearthguard of Amon-Sul, maybe one of the less scary Cardolan skirmishers, which have taken up a pretty nasty position up here on this fortification. And it is these crossbows which are going to be causing Isengard and Angmar the most distress, you would suggest. Interesting that some of the Minhiriath sharpshooters are down on the lower terrain as well, mind you. And over here, the Dunedain Rangers from the Shire firing into the advancing Angmar, and maybe this fractured approach from the Hobbits is an attempt to try and get their missiles to do much of the heavy lifting for them. Tookish Hunters back there battling Brandybucks, more Tookish Hunters. We saw the Tookish Hunters be surprisingly effective in melee of all things in the last battle, but we'll see. I'm not sure whether these front lines that have been laid on so far by the Hobbits are completely up to standard, however. It's all well and good trying to go for this approach of where you're not really intending to win the melee engagement. It's more about whittling the enemy down with ranged units, and then by the time they do make it through, they realise they haven't actually got enough to make it stick. But you do need at least to be able to slow them down enough to be able to do that damage in the first place, and so far you would worry for the Hobbits in that regard. One of the most heavy-duty factions the game has to offer in Angmar against, certainly one of the lightest individually in the shape of the Hobbits. You can see that the Ents are coming in here as well. Clash of the Titans between them and the Northern Trolls. Great Eagles may find their purpose in this battle in the late game, but at this stage, when things are a little bit more constricted, I doubt that will be the case. Shouts of the Farthings activating themselves now, throwing their pebbles, doing damage to the Angmar reinforcements that are sweeping forward now, including the Hammer Guard. As if on cue, the Cardolan line's also being tested by another avenue of assault for the Angmarim. Angmar Marauders, the ones first in. Interesting that Isengard have been so willing to maintain their position for now. They're taking a fair amount of damage, but only Snaga skirmishers in all fairness. Wathlo trackers, the crossbows for Cardolan, however, are also biding their time and waiting. Uruk-hai crossbows trying to do some damage to the Tharbad warhammers over the houses, managing to score a few hits, but it's not the easiest shot to make. Still Angmar over here, not too interested in moving in for the time being. Instead, they're going to try and soften the enemy up first and foremost with a few volleys from the Snaga archers. Maybe Rudaur, I mean the carrot that is being dangled in front of Rudaur here is the fact that if they can force Arthedain back, it cuts off what would be the ultimate final stand for the enemy team as a whole. It means that Imladris on one side and then Cardolan / the Hobbits on the other side have a limited amount of room which they can retreat to before encountering Rhudaur. It puts Rhudaur in harm's way, but it also limits the options of the defenders. And ultimately this battle would be the same whether it's fought now or later on, so I suppose from a Rhudaur perspective it makes sense that this is how they've chosen to conduct their business. Arthedain marksman reloading for another volley. I mean, Rhudaur will be fairly vulnerable to this sort of thing. The Isengard ballista once again, instead of shooting directly across the bridges, trying instead to offer some support to the attacking armies in the lower reaches of the settlement. Missing on these occasions, however. And it's against a unit which is not quite as all-round useful as the Minhiriath sharpshooters. Elven archers though they may be, but the punch that those Minhiriath sharpshooters could have had were they still alive will be sorely missed. Missiles being used. Trollshaw axe throws in position. It's a fairly early commitment of these Trollshaws as well. Throwing axes, well known for how effective they can be, especially at busting through the kind of units Arthedain usually traffic in with those Arthedain pikemen on the front line, and they are taking damage, but they are weak enough to arrow fire that basic Arthedain marksmen should be able to scythe through them pretty fast. Several Rhudaur marksmen as well. Rhudaur do still have units that can be committed forward as reinforcements, but so far Arthedain will be pretty happy with how that initial engagement has gone. Meanwhile, Isengard still fully willing to be a little bit more withdrawn as well. So far it's winged swordsmen and added men that have been the ones to take a far more aggressive approach than their allies, King Arthur and Tommy the Unwise. Having said that, more reinforcements still, Angmar with yet another wave, breaking upon what remains of the Hobbit lines, and let's be honest, that's not all that much at this point. They still have some Hobbitry in arms. We saw the Great Eagles try to get a volley or two off Longbottom mob, not unlike that defence of Hobbiton. We are seeing once again the fact that the Hobbits may have to forego utilising all of their ammunition just through the need for more melee infantry. I mean, that is going to be devastating to the Snaga Stalkers, not exactly the most dangerous unit of Angmarim infantry, but you definitely need to try and stem the tide somehow, do a little bit of damage to the manpower which is crashing down upon you. As the army continues its forward march, the bandits over here from Cardolan this time, clad in their slightly lighter colours, trying to stop the march of Angmar marauders, lowly units on both sides of the conflict here. Sheriffs of the Farthings. Minhiriath sharpshooters starting to fire away as well, albeit it's in probably not the direction that Seraphim would have chosen, set up presumably to try and combat the threat that Isengard pose. Speaking of which, Isengard are now making their first plays, although Cardolan, with all of their units on station, ready to meet that advance. There goes the Angmar general. The Orcs may panic as a result of that charge from the Great Eagles, but you can see here as well, Trolls of the White Hand being met by the Tharbad Warhammers, which is worrying for them. They'll do a fair amount of damage to these cheap Cardolan pikes, but the Trolls should melt away under the blows of those hammers pretty quickly. Spearmen ready to be sent in as well. So far the Angmar morale holding up, and I mean, they still have a decent amount of momentum behind them, and well, I say that. Pikemen are routing, Snaga are routing. What looked to be a slipping situation for the Hobbits is turning into a bit of a Matador and the Bull kind of situation between the Hobbits and their slightly duller counterparts, but Angmar do still have a fair amount left in the tank to continue to bring forwards more Guardians of Kharndoon, so they do reveal themselves now, some of the heavy infantry. Great Eagles starting to lose some of their number, but not enough for the Hobbits to be overly concerned. Longbottom mob, not the highest of base damage, but this is a consistent amount of damage which is falling down upon the Angmarim. We make our way back across to the other side. This Angmar army, I think at this point, based on how things are going on the other side, they need to start thinking about putting Imladris under a little bit more pressure than this. If the battle was going in their favour on the other side, then they could afford to maybe rest on their laurels a little bit more and wait until Imladris need to siphon off support, and then they could hit them. But as things are maybe not going completely to code for them, they may need to start committing a little bit more. Ones in the north firing in, and also Rudaur up here are struggling. I mean, this is not the kind of warfare that Rudaur are most well known for engaging in, so it perhaps shouldn't be too surprising that maybe they are struggling a little bit. Sort of from, I mean, Imladris are actually sending over some units now. If the Womb Raider feels comfortable enough to do this, it's a sign that the attackers are maybe being a little bit too lax in that regard. Again, very different approaches from some individual attacking armies. Some being very conservative, others being very aggressive, that sort of fragmented nature. We've seen it be the doom of many an attacking effort in the past. Arrows looping over, Isengard trying to put these Cardolan lines under a little bit more pressure. Some more Minhiriath men-at-arms were committed. I mean, this is a large amount. As much as the Trolls may be suffering a little bit with the Tharbad Warhammers here, through sheer weight of numbers, Isengard are trying to make something happen now. And that could prove to be a real momentum shifter in this fight. Looks like these out-of-ammunition Gwathlo trackers in desperation are going to try and plug the gap. Crossbow bolts and javelins will be capable of doing a fair amount of damage. More units having to be siphoned off the front line. If this was in conjunction with Angmar still having enough left in the tank to seriously threaten the hobbits, it would probably be better for the attackers, but as it is, I'm not completely sold on this. I think the defenders have done a pretty reasonable job so far of doing a lot of damage to the attackers, and Turkish hunters, long bottom mobs, still with plenty of ammunition, pulling back several of their units to form up another line, Proudfoot protectors. Again, much like we saw in the defence of Hobbiton, I'm actually impressed with how the Shire rats have done. Banderbrass archers. Very impressed with them last time out. For the time being, we won't see their surprising prowess in melee, but as much ammunition as they can get down range to try and blunt Isengard, who stand a better chance at getting through Cardolan now. They are really starting to crank up the pressure a little bit more, as it were. There's also the Berserkers. Definitely a good choice of target. Cardolan don't have much that would enjoy facing Berserkers in melee. I'm surprised as well at the resilience that the Trolls of the White Hand have shown. And we are starting to see Cardolan's quality on the front line start to look a little bit suspect. I mean, Trolls are still alive. There's also the Nazkai in amongst things. The Pikes are a little bit all over the place, it must be said, but as soon as they can get themselves situated, that will surely be the beginning of the end for the Cardolan efforts to hold on to this lower part of the settlement. There's still plenty of ground for Isengard to have to move through, and as a result the Great Eagles also beginning their movements to try and bail their allies out a little bit. Meanwhile, you can see now the reinforcements from Imladris moving forward, and Imladris units in general should be, well, the entry level ones at the very least, should be fairly efficient against the Black Wolves that Rudaur have elected to send in. Similar to the Uruk-hai Berserkers, of course, in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. Grey Company, to have multiple units of rangers facing you down when your only choice of advancing is across a bridge, in all fairness to Rudaur, is something that even the likes of the dwarves would not particularly like in this current version of the game, and Rudaur themselves, with their defensive deficiencies, probably even less so. Black Wolves, more of them. I mean, the Isengard Ballista is still here. Arthedain Rangers, who probably have given, or tried to give as good as they can get. Swords drawn. I don't know how much Rudaur have left in the tank, mind you. Still, there's a largely full Angmarim army over here. They have at least begun their assault now, trying to put this Imladris line under a little bit more pressure than we've seen previous. We've also got Barrow-wights, which of course their unit model, this sort of rather bizarre green one, is being replaced by one that's far more fitting, I think, in the new version of the game, so this will probably be one of the last times we see them as they are here. Archers of Rivendell, God Helem also firing in, trying to do as much damage to the Barrow-wights as they possibly can, in conjunction with the Blackwatch Legion and the rest of the heavy Angmar units. This is perhaps... They've not had much to deal with in terms of their side of the settlement so far, Imladris, but the pressure is being turned up very quickly now, as Angmar are wont to do. And Imladris Guardians are here. Maybe the period of inactivity has lulled Imladris into a false sense of security. As much as their quality is all well and good, Angmar do still represent a very real threat to them, infantry-wise. My swordmaster, so I mean, if the momentum does peter out for Angmar, that's where the problems will start to arise, because the sheer quality of Imladris will start to take over, but as it is, for now, it continues. The Hammerguard represent a real threat as well. There's also the Blackguard, so now King Arthur is pretty much throwing everything in. I mean, you definitely need to be testing this angle as well for me. Imladris are pretty vulnerable from this angle. I mean, it's only Angmar Marauders and Halberds, but at the very least it would put them under some serious pressure. But it is good at least to see a change in tactic. Oof, what's going on here? That has got to be the Ballista. And those Dunedain Troll Slayers getting utterly devastated. Still fighting hard up here. I mean, a combination of the reinforcements Imladris sent up here and what remains of Arthedain should be enough to get the job done, even with artillery support, but trying to even the odds for later is going to be key, especially considering Isengard are on the march, though Isengard do not, as we can see, have a monopoly on artillery presence in the battle. Arthedain getting their own back, partially at the very least, on the Isengard column as it moves forward. Some pretty nasty shots, and then they will reposition. The hobbits moving a little bit further backwards. Isengard now the ones that are also attempting to test the hobbit lines. What remains of Cardolan, I wonder? We take stock of everything. That's a lot of corpses on the floor. So, I mean, Isengard do have a decent force left. There's a few units mixed in here from Angmar as well, though it must be said I think the hobbits did a pretty good job at stifling the angmarim momentum over here. We'll see if Imladris can do the same on the other side. Moving further up, I mean, they do need to set up another defensive position as well, and they only have so long to do that. Isengard working to try and cut the hobbits off, and if they do get surrounded, all of the good work they did may end up being for nothing in the long run. The hobbits are also not going to be the sort of faction which can withstand this kind of boxing in by a heavy-duty faction like Isengard as much as others may be. A little bit of support maybe coming in from Cardolan as well, some artillery help. Lords of the North utilising their armour-piercing arrows, the dismounted Knights of Illuminus on the front line, though against the Witch Realm Enslavers, in terms of unit type versus unit type, that's not the most advantageous engagement for them at all. Ashnor's Troll Hunters. Angmar now really moving forwards as well. Took a little bit longer than would have been ideal, but really trying to put Imladris under a huge amount of pressure now. Even if Imladris do fight their way out of here, it will be as shadows of their former selves. Along, Imladris Guardians, defeat is a distinct possibility. Barrow White's still in decent number. It's looking like Angmar may very well be victorious against the elves over here. Maybe the decision to siphon off those reinforcements early where maybe it wasn't entirely necessary, at least not in the numbers we saw, may prove to be a bit of an error, although even over here we're starting to see Rudaur claw their way back into this with the support of those Ballistae. Maybe the decision to retreat needs to be taken sooner rather than later. Point-blank javelin fire. Trying to do the business here. I mean, they're continuing to do damage to the attackers as they move forward, but the attackers seem to still have enough left in the tank to make this work. Cardolan with their retreated units, there's a bit of an I'm alright Jack kind of mentality there, because they retreated just fine, but the hobbits seem to have been left in the lurch a little bit. So these Isengard units looking like they may rout, mind you. Wavering the Uruk-hai pikemen, a little bit more damage done to them, and they may very well quit the field. There's still a troll left alive. Well, there goes the hobbit general. Is this where the morale starts to fall apart? Banderbrass archers finally bring down that final troll. Very weird kind of situation here. Uruk-hai archers setting up in firing position with enemy units right next to them. Nazkai defeat is a distinct possibility, which is a rare enough thing. That must be as a result of range support coming in. Even in this situation, the hobbits are proving to be an awkward foe to completely finish off. Guards of Orthanc on the way forward. I mean, they surely will be finished off. Isengard should have their second victory in succession. Cardolan on their way back down now, maybe a little bit too little too late. Even with units like the Hearthguard and the Manitar Roman Gatekeepers being of good quality, I don't know whether that's necessarily going to be enough to completely turn the tide over here. I don't know whether there's going to be many hobbits left to save. Mind you, perhaps it's worth a go. The momentum in this battle as a whole has certainly shifted slightly in favour of the attackers. Victory for the Barrow Whites, perhaps. There's still some good quality units in here, though. 22 Gwaithir Myrdain. The small matter of that trebuchet support as well. We've already seen how artillery can change the fate of an engagement in this one. And of course Angmar more likely to rout under such pressures and rigours than Imladris are. Angmar halberdiers. What have we here? Snaga. Some more Imladris units, many of them the out-of-ammunition skirmishers, though when it comes to elves that isn't too much of an insult. The God Helene in particular, a scary foe for basic marauders to have to face, especially when the marauders are taking hits from afar as well. Wardens of the North firing away, Dunedain Rangers further up. Perhaps seeing the danger that a slightly healthier Angmar army still poses, more emphasis being given to this engagement than the slightly more battered and bruised Isengard on the other side. Perhaps a little bit of credence does need to be given to the remnants of Rhudaur as well, though, who look as though they're going to fight their way through these bridges. Well, I say that. 100 Dunedain Troll Slayers block the way. The Cardolan general falls. That's a bad sign for Cardolan. Just like the hobbits, they are now leaderless over here. Banderbrass archers rather fittingly are leaving Cardolan to their fate as well. Sharpshooters, armour-piercing though they may be, the morale is looking a little bit suspect here. Pikes, Nazkai, Isengard still in more than adequate fighting condition to keep the pressure up. High crossbowmen scurrying around. Don't know how much ammunition a lot of these units necessarily have left. That's a fairly big rout. 85 marauders. And what remains of Angmar, Minotaur, Roman gatekeepers are shaken as well, as much as the armour piercing is useful enough. Simply too many Uruk-hai, perhaps. Still crossbows and javelins with ammunition as well. It's turning into a rather stretched affair here as the game reaches its conclusion. And the real question is whether Isengard here and Angmar over on the other side have got enough left in the tank. I think, from a Rudaur perspective, they have got relatively little left. God Helene, oof. I mean, that goes through the back of their own units as well, which is, again, far more likely to rout Rudaur than it is the Dunedain or the High Elves. It's been a real force of destruction, the Isengard Ballista, in this game, but they need to make sure that it maintains that distinction in favour of the attackers. If they start doing friendly fire, that's exactly the sort of gift that the defenders will be looking for. Ones of the North, it does look as though Imladris, in this corner over here where they were taking shelter, I don't know. I mean, the Barrow Whites, I think there are enough Barrow Whites to... I don't know, it's going to be very, very close. It'll be a Pyrrhic victory one way or the other. If it's in favour of Imladris, then they will have a few units that can maybe try and get into the rear of this Angmar army, which is still on the forward march now. Combination of the very best skirmishers that Imladris and Arthedain have to offer, both of which coming equipped with their extensive melee abilities as well. Oof, again, bit of friendly fire in there. In all fairness, trying to hit the God Helene in the back is probably the play to make here. Scourge Raiders are still down there, in numbers. Dunedain scouts firing away. They may have been inactive for a while, the Angmarim on this side, but as so often happens, it means that in the late game they have a surprising amount still at their disposal, and more orcs arriving from this side over here. I think the attacks are going to have too much left to them. That trebuchet point blank hits. I mean, they have got the ideal hits. If they can make this work at this range, routing is quite necessary. They may then be able to reposition and hope springs eternal, but well, we shall see. You can see the eagles in the background over there, feasting upon the Scourge Raiders, which are waiting in reserve. It's a bit unfortunate. You can see exactly what T.S. Niehoff wants to do. Whether or not Medieval 2 artillery is going to play ball remains to be seen. That engagement will go their way regardless, but it will speed things along if they can rout them completely. Though it's also very obvious what they want to do. The Rudaur General falls. That may be the end of the Hillmen. Dunedain Rangers, both in Cardolan and I think Arthedainian colours. No, those are just the green hoods of the Cardolan Rangers. The black hoods the Arthedainian ones. We have the Troll Slayers at the very least over here, who should be able to finish off what remains. The Isengard Ballista crew and the Ettenmoor's Troll Hunters going to be no match for the blows of those axes. Dunedain Rangers on the way back over here, those Vanderbrass Archers acting as little more than a speed bump, trying to cover the Trebuchet, which of course is still very necessary for their chances of victory here. The Cardolan Rangers will try and do the same, but how much time can they really buy? They have anything right at the very top of the settlement? They do not. And the Trebuchet crew abandoning it, seeing that it's just not going to work, so they're instead just going to take up the swords, try and make that work for them. To the north, sheer quality, is that going to be how they can make this their victory? It looks as though there's 11 Marrowites still left over there, but some Imladris Guardians return, as do some Eldarenway Swordmasters. Will it be a heroic end, or will the sheer quality of some of the units left be enough? I mean, the fact that there are still Blackguard and the like makes me doubt that. Still Guards of Orthanc as well, further up the hill from Isengard. Scourge Raiders, if they still have ammunition as well. All things do point to an attacking win. There's quite a lot of Troll Slayers, mind you. Nazkai, 12 of them. Uruk-hai Archers. Much maligned though they may be, archers of any description at this late stage in a battle will be extremely welcomed, I'm sure. Though with the numbers being what they are, the Nazkai will find themselves trampled underfoot by the Dunedain. Worthy foes at the best of times. There goes the Arthedain General, under the blow of a Hammer Guardsman as well, rather fittingly. Dunedain Rangers looking like they may flee. Concentration of force has been fairly key here. Individual elements of the defence have gone pretty well for the defenders, but the overall picture has still been one of slow but sure territorial loss. And both Isengard and actually, despite the slow burn, King Arthur's Angmar army have been the primary cause of that. Winged Swordsmen had a little bit more trouble against the Hobbits, given the terrain and given the tactics they employed, and Rudaur were always going to have a tough time on those bridges against a force like Arthedain, who had very clearly were set up to defend such ground. Victory seems certain. Yeah, numbers wise I think it's just going to be too much. This little frontline engagement looks as though it will go against Angmar. Angmar may well find themselves defeated, but I'm not sure whether they're going to have what it takes to also finish off the remnants of Isengard, which are going to be coming towards them as well. Let's see. 4 Dunedain scouts. I mean, I wonder how much ammunition they have left. Still, I mean, to be fair, Winged Swordsman does still have some units left alive, in spite of the awkward road that he had to take to get here. Further over here, it's going to be a final stand, and maybe fittingly, it is going to be the Warns of the North and the God Halim. You can see actually the difference between the survivability of both units as well, with the Warns of the North having only 11 remaining and the God Halim having 27. Quality indeed. Those throwing axes, though, are not going to be particularly good for the long-term health of perhaps the very best that the elves have left to offer. Having that kind of unit in reserve late on also proving to be a useful thing indeed. Look at the difference. I mean, 4%, apparently 100% of the defenders killed, but 4% seems about right. Twists and turns in the first half of the battle, for sure, but as soon as momentum was truly seized by the attackers, it did feel like it slipped through their fingers somewhat. The Angmar general does fall at the very least. One last spit in the eye. Does it indeed. That last of Imladris? Are they truly quitting the field first? I find that hard to believe. They are actually. God, Helene did rout. Takes a lot to do that to Imladris. Crossbows. So what is left? What's the final unit left? There has to be something, surely. Oh, I see, it's the Dunedain scouts. They will valiantly charge in. I mean, to be fair, they chose the Angmar Marauders at the very least, but that's surely going to be the end of them. Ooh, and the Elven general captured by the Orcs as well. So there we have it. And I think just about deserved. I think that the attackers, when they committed forwards, they fully committed to it. Like I said, it was a little bit fragmented early on, but it's a weird shape of settlement, and every single one of the attackers had something slightly different that they had to work with. Like, for example, over here there was that L-shaped position that Imladris had themselves embedded into, so maybe it was a little bit understandable that Angmar were a little bit reluctant to move forward right from the off. Obviously Rudaur had the bridges that they had to contend with, a pretty grisly situation for them. Isengard had flatter terrain and more options, but also the overwatch from those crossbows was pretty nasty. And then over on the far side, up against the cliff, you had the hobbits, which are always going to be slightly awkward because of their ability to hide and their skirmishers and the like. So, yeah, I think overall the attackers do deserve a lot of credit for how they managed to pick their way through the settlement, even though some of them fell in the process. As for the defenders, what could they have done a little bit differently? I feel as though the position of Imladris actually maybe ended up not being quite so useful for them. If they were going to back themselves into that corner, they needed to have all of their skirmishers on hand and ready, and maybe they sent over a few too many reinforcement units to the middle to help Arthedain out. I feel as though Arthedain, given the shape of the engagement on those bridges, given what Rudaur had to work with, given the kind of faction Arthedain are, you really should be able to finish your own dinner in that sort of situation if you're Arthedain, without needing quite so much help. And I don't think they did need that much help. I think, you know, having a unit of archers of Rivendell on hand to try and blunt that Angmar assault earlier on would have been helpful, at least. And over on the other side, I think Cardolan front-loading their defence maybe was a little bit of a mistake, given how when Isengard really did come forward with a little bit of angmarim support, they couldn't really withstand them, and ultimately that ended up with some hobbits getting left behind, and then consequently later on Cardolan also got left behind by the hobbits, and etc, etc. But still, let's see what did the damage from Imladris at the very least. Plenty of kills, including, well, the God Helene getting 380. Quite a lot of those in melee as well, so the multifaceted nature of that unit coming into play. Gwaithir Myrdain doing nicely, the basic archers also, you know, a sign that they were used wisely in one way or another. This background always makes it so difficult to read the actual things. I know what the pattern's all about, but still. Eldrainway Swordmaster's doing nicely, but a lot of the basic units, not so much, and that's because when Angmar did move forward, it was with overwhelming force, so the elves couldn't really get settled, and not allowing the elves to get settled and comfortable is the way that you face off against them, and that goes for all four of the Elven factions, really. Imladris are able to withstand this kind of pressure better than most, but given the ground they were fighting in, even they were taken to task a little bit by Angmar on this occasion. And on this occasion, you can't even say that it was all down to the Witches because they were not present. So yeah, big thank you to the Womb Raider for sending this one in to me. This is, after all, his first map, and it's pretty good for a first map, I have to say. It's unique in the way that it's set out, and it's somewhat similar to the other map that we've seen as well already from him on the new patch. That one was made after this one, but because I obviously prioritised the new patch stuff, this one's going to be a little bit further away, but even so, very happy to show it off nonetheless. Big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of this one. Plenty of familiar faces here once again. As for what's going to be coming up soon, I do have a few things from the recent Silmarillion update that I want to show, so they're going to be immediately coming out following this one. I think maybe 2 in a row even, just to mix things up a little bit. There is also a couple more battles to make my way through on the backlog for the previous version of Reforged, as it's going to be continuously known, I think, from this point onwards. So I want to get through all of them, and of course, as I get them, stuff from the new patch, especially if it comes down to new set-piece maps like we've seen recently from Kirith and Gol and the like, we're going to be obviously prioritising them as well, but I can't really be sure when they're coming out, or if they are, if I'm going to be away on a work trip or something similar when that happens. I really hope that I'm not away for work when the new patch drops, because that would just be bloody typical, wouldn't it? But hopefully, long term, I know I've been saying this pretty much for the last year and a half, but hopefully that won't be the case indefinitely. I've kind of got a more solid idea of what's going to be happening now. Again, I know that I said that as of about half a year ago as well, but I feel more convinced this time around. I mean, I know exactly what's going to be happening at some point. It's just a case of when, and also the mechanics of how that's going to be happening in terms of moving from my current position to another one, and that other position should be a little bit more user-friendly in terms of me being able to produce content, and also being a little bit more active with the channel and with the general community and that sort of thing, because I've been pretty damn poor at that over the course of the last year, in particular because of work. Probably one of the worst jobs I could ever pick to try and run a YouTube channel alongside. But hopefully that will not be the case for much longer. But again, I've already mentioned how wedging such statements at the end of videos like this is not terribly useful, so I'm going to try my best to stop that. But as it is, always keep an eye on the community section, and maybe we can do a channel update video in the near future as well regarding that in a little bit more detail. Yeah, big thank you to all the players once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.